Okay, thank you very much. I really appreciated the last talk, and I would just to recall your attention to one document. I am a member of the European Group on Ethics in Science and New Technologies, which is an advisory body of the European Commission. And it's very interesting that the first request of the President of the European Commission was about the future of work and the ethical aspects of the regulation. And we stressed 2 points, and one is about social security, exactly what you mentioned in the conclusion, because we always think about flexibilization of work, but we need to think also about flexibilization of social security. Otherwise, there is a gap between the two. And there is a very interesting document, which is not very well known, that is European Pillars of Social Rights. That is a document of the European Commission. It's not binding, but there is a new word that is flexicurity. That's the combination between flexibility and security. And the second point I want to raise is about, you mentioned in one slide the high skills requirement. And of course, with digitalization, we need high skill requirements, but in our document, we stressed the problem of justice, because of course, you have a sort of gap between the people who are capable of acquiring the digital skills and people who can be left behind. I mentioned, for example, people with cognitive impairment, or old people who are not able or not capable to acquire these digital skills. That's why we mentioned also in our document the question of education. So we need not only to develop digital skills, but also to help people who are not able to participate in this new kind of works. Above all, we mentioned, we preferred the word capacities and capabilities instead of skills, because skills is a little bit, can be used and applied in a discriminatory way. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much for this question and for mentioning the issue of flexicurity. This is also something I had in mind, because social security can really be a basis to be flexible then. And what I would try to say is that both parties involved have certain interests regarding flexibility. One is reconciling, of course, family and work life, for example. On the other hand, of course, companies also have interests regarding flexibility, but social security is then a basis to be, well, more flexible on both sides of the market. And I think you are completely right regarding the requirements. What we know from our studies is that we really have to talk about competencies. And on the one hand, what is needed, I think, in all kind of occupations are digital competencies, in all kind of occupations. I think nobody will really can say, well, it does not touch me, it does not have any relevance for me. But on the other hand, is that what you mentioned is that non-digital competencies, so where people cannot be substituted and their competencies cannot be substituted, something which we really have to bear in mind. And this also have to do with the other thing you mentioned, education. And I think there is now a need to prevent, especially the poverty of education, very, very early, in order to develop people and to make them ready for these challenges and for these changes. And this is something which is not new, but I think if we look at developments, it's even more urgent really to restrict the poverty of education as much as it is possible.
Thanks, Gustavo. I just wanted to follow up on the last question about the ethical dimension, and especially since this is about the dignity of work. When I look at, digitalization in the workplace and the future of work, oftentimes it looks like we have 21st century technology with 19th century patterns of labor protections. And I think this is a huge aspect when it comes to the dignity of work, which Catholic social teaching has a lot to say about. Like we all know the story of, California has basically said Uber and these other companies have to stop this scam of pretending they're workers are not actually workers, so they can deny them basic benefits. So I was wondering, how do we grapple with this kind of problem, this gig economy, this digitalization? And I know that, Catholic social teaching has been developed, has a lot of answers to that. Stronger unionization, co-determination, which has worked so well in Germany, and also like profit sharing. Like going back to the example of Uber, why can't workers own the company? They already own the capital. It just makes such sense. So I'm just wondering, can we think more about the ethical dimensions of this shift, and especially when it comes to worker dignity, and maybe some of the older insights from Catholic social teaching can actually inform the newer insights from this new digital economy?
Well, a rather difficult question for me, because I really not so much involved in this kind of the debate, but I think you are completely right if you look at the speed of, on the one hand, changes in this kind of digital world, and on the other hand, changes regarding labor market institutions and how we prepare people. This was the issue of education, or how do we deal, or how do we establish our social security systems. And if we look at speed, we also see that even if we look at companies, we see different speeds of development. We have countries, for example, over companies, we do studies in which we see that companies have digitalized their products and services much more than others. We even learn from this kind of countries what their strategies are, and what we do see, and this is some kind of a hope in my respect, is that they all know that they are nothing, that they really are nothing without their without their workers, and they have really to take the workers with them. And for that reason, especially the things like social dialogue between companies and workers is something which is really getting more importance. All the big companies in Germany now, they really see this digital transformation, and now the government, for example, has supported this process by large programs dealing with further training, but also the trade unions and the employer organizations now are more or less have the same opinion and the same view on it, that they have to work together to get really this structural change really going. They do not want to restrict structural change, but they want to have this structural change, but it should be kind of accompanied by such a process. And for that reason, I think that there are solutions on the government side, but also regarding social dialogue.
Rocco. Thank you very much for your stimulating exposition. I am, however, not only convinced of the statistical data you produced for several reasons. First of all, we have a lot of people but the statistics of unemployment may be sometimes be satisfying, but nevertheless, in the country, we find a lot of people who are angry because they've lost their job and they did not find another one, whilst new jobs were produced and they had not the skills to take these new jobs. There is a very important problem that is even enlarged if you consider the fact that there is a large black economy in all European countries, but especially in some of them, that is not at all considered, and in which, it seems to me, the conditions of the workers have become much worse under the pressure of the salaries of the now developing countries who used to produce a large part of the manufacture that used to be produced by us. So this is the first problem that I think should be addressed. A second problem, somebody already mentioned this, is the fact that we have a very high level of frictional employment, not in all countries, only in some of them, but this is a level that can be really very high. I mean, we have jobs, and we do not have the people who have the skills to take those jobs, and we have a lot of people who are unskilled or who have skills that have been overcome through the technological process, and they remain unemployed. A third element is, well, when you think of people who are employed, I think a distinction should be made between people who are employed in productive jobs, that is, jobs who are exposed to international competition in sectors that draw wealth in the country, and people who are employed in more or less subsidized jobs. Why do I say this? Because if you have, like in some European countries, a very strong economy that stands on the world market and draws resources from the world market, then you can subsidize jobs. Some of the jobs of Germany, for instance, are clearly one way or another subsidized by the government, and they can do that because they have the money to do that. In other countries, this is not the case. So it is important to see, also to have an idea of the policies that can be introduced to tackle this situation. Now I have said this, and I already repent having said it, because I wonder whether there is a situation of yesterday, not so much of today, because today we have an enormous level of tax elusion and tax evasion of the big companies that used to bring so much wealth within the most advanced European economies. These are some political problems that I see, and I understand we do not have the statistical analysis that allow us to understand, but you see them, they are on the table. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your presentation. I have a reflection on what we might call the digital exuberance that is now going global. And we might say that as greater categories of work migrate to the digital sphere, maybe we can paraphrase Tolstoy that all the companies are happy the same way, bottom line, but each company is unhappy in its own way. I'm intrigued by your German data. Not too long ago, I was at AT&T headquarters in Dallas. AT&T now has AT&T University. This is a very, very large company, employs over 250,000 workers. And larger shares of the work are now done both in vivo, and then they migrate to the digital world. So I asked the numero dos, John Stansky, who is now the head of Time Warner, by the way, what he worries when he wakes up in the morning. And he said something very interesting, and that is the emails. So you move, and AT&T comes and they install the cable for your television, for your computers, for your phones. And of course, you're not paying attention, you're doing a million other things. And at 2 o'clock in the morning, you try to turn on the computer, and the computer doesn't work. So you text the worker a question about how do you plug this, or how do you enable that. And evidently, the main concern now is that the texts of the workers are illiterate. Meaning, before we get to a digital set of either skills or competencies or sensibilities, we have a stratum that is more fundamental. And that is the domain of basic education. Basic reading, basic writing, which is increasingly weakened by the structures and the habits that the digital world is creating. Meaning, we no longer read. Deep reading as a category of human cognition is being evaporated as we speak. Deep writing is being evaporated as we speak. A category of labor that is growing is college students in the United States are asked to write a paper on Professor Sachs' theory of inequality. So now, evidently, what you do is you go to a Ghanaian or a Nigerian person that will write the term paper for a student at Stanford or at UCLA or at MIT. So we have to keep in mind, before we become overly effervescent about the promise of digital work, the fundamentals that remain a challenge.
Thank you. A third question?
I just would like to underline something that is happening around the world. I have in mind something that is happening with Amazon Mechanical Turk. I don't know how much you are aware of this kind of platform. Amazon is selling through AWS something that we could call human work through an API. That means that there is the huge platform in which the cognitive function that cannot be made through a server are sold through human work. So this is a new phase of digital work in which the poorest part of the country can digital work in a global market, and they have to sell just their cognitive function. And that is challenging, looking at the model that you present, in the sense that probably the biggest part of the market of digital work is played in that model, that it's more a global sell in less I ask, more I work. Then, looking at the standard company, there was an interesting paper of The Economist that was suggesting that probably in the future we could have just the C-level that has a standard job for a company, CIO, CFO, and so on, and all the other job could be on call. So also the not self-employed could become self-employed. And the third consideration, just to make as complex as could be the labor market, I had some of personal conversation with people like Brad Smith and another IT big boss. And the IT company are simple surrogating function that before was owned by state and government. Education, money, identity, and things like that. So looking at the digital transformation of the world, of the labor market also, should be also put in consideration that the standard place of power are not anymore so workable for this kind of situation. Because the identity sometimes is given not anymore by a state, but by a platform, and so on.
Okay, I will try my very best and to restrict my time also to First of all, concerning
The microphone,
okay.
please.
Concerning the first questions regarding job changes, I think what we also would expect, I was talking about structural change, is that the quality of work can of course be affected if we look at job changes. For example, what you mentioned earlier with your 20,000 jobs in the coal industry and a less carbonized economy. We also, almost the same in Germany, and now we have this plan to get out of this coal production. On the other hand, these jobs have rather high wages at the moment compared to the rest of the economy. So the question is, of course, what is the alternative for the workers? So there will be definitely some frictions. So will you then be a car driver or whatsoever? So that's a question, that this kind of transformation is something which may also influence the composition of the quality of work, and the workers, they are really asking, what is my alternative? And the only answer is that they again have to invest in skill development and development of competencies. And what is also of interest, because you mentioned frictions of employment, and I think there are two types of frictions, and you need, I think, definitely different answers. One is that, of course, your job within a firm can change. And the other is that you will lose your job and then you need a new job. So these are two different kind of things. And at the very beginning, it's of course difficult to say how many jobs can be saved within the company and be changed. And the other thing is how many of them will go. And I think in this respect, the German government has now done something which, in my point of view, is a good idea. We have, of course, to evaluate this program. But what they now have offered is within firm training, so that is subsidized in order to meet the challenges of structural change. That means firms will get a subsidy for further training in order to upskill workers. On the other hand, of course, you then need, of course, reskilling for workers who have to make a new start. What was also mentioned by people in the audience is the issue of basic education as something which is really maybe the most important issue in order to deal with all these challenges. And you mentioned that this is endangered in a way by the digital transformation. I would fully agree. And I think that this basic education and its improvement is very important for tasks which cannot be substituted by computers at the end of the day. So they are then the asset we have at the end of the day. So that would be my view on this. And concerning the platform economy and Amazon Mechanical Turks and things like that, I think, as I already mentioned, these platforms are used in two different ways. One is definitely more local because it's offline. So these are services. A driver, if you ask for a driver, the driver needs to be here at this place if you want to go, for example, to the airport. But then there are, of course, these online activities which are global. And we have to see both kind of areas, and both will bring more self-employment into the system. And the persons on call is something, I think it's spreading in many countries. And I also know from the UK that this, for example, they have this kind of 0-hour contract where you really even do not know how far you will be called. It would even be possible that you won't be called. And this are, of course, types of employment which need to be regulated in a more pronounced way. And there I would also think that, because you mentioned this, that social security is of course one precondition for flexibility, but also a good regulation is at the end of the day also a precondition to get all the opportunities of flexibility.
Okay, two final comments and we are running out of time. Very brief, please.
Do we have time for one more? First of all, thank you. Very, very interesting presentation. Also a very pressing issue with the ILO as well, with the new standard forms of employment and the gig economy. So I was wondering, should certain forms of such employment be restricted? For instance, they often, well not often, but they can result of a disruption. If we take a clear example like Uber, you even have cities banning their diffusion. So, and if it shouldn't be restricted, surely there should be some sort of policy available to deal with the displaced workers. And on that note, does your data for Germany at all show any signs of disruption? That's everything, thanks.
No, unfortunately, we do not, at the moment, we do not see signs of disruption. This also may have to do that, for example, Uber is something which is not really very present in Germany at the moment. There are only some cities where this is allowed, and also there were regulations to prevent Uber from offering services. But of course, this is not something which is, I think, in my point of view, sustainable. You have to regulate this industry in a way where different suppliers can offer services.
Okay, thank you so much. After having lunch, I think that a very brief conclusion of this whole session could be: the sharing economy cannot work without sharing its profit. Thank you. At 3 o'clock, we will be coming back.